A good day to all. My name is Brad Whitworth, and I want to welcome you to the Circle of Fellows. This is our broadcast number 27, and in just a couple of seconds, I'll ask my panelists to introduce themselves. We're here to discuss a movement toward converged communication functions with marketing, communications, HR, IT, sort of how are things structured, where are things going, what are the trends today, what are the advantages, disadvantages of communications being converged in organizations, and what does it mean for some of the traditional practices around public relations, corporate communications, employee communications, social media. And with me, I have 4 IABC Fellows to be able to talk about this interesting topic, which is the subject matter of the November issue online of Communication World. So we hope to be able to take those topics and explore them a little bit more deeply. So starting with on my little panel, we just go ahead and introduce and let them introduce themselves a little bit. Priya Bates.
Hello, everyone. Nice to join you here from Toronto, Canada. I'm Priya Bates, and I am president of Inner Strength Communication, an organization that manages engagement, change, and communication solutions to help organizations manage deliver business results. So I'm really excited about this converging disciplines conversation.
And then I have up alphabetically Ms. Kellie Garrett.
Hello, I am in snowy Regina, Saskatchewan, Canada, and I run my own firm, having become a recovering executive. I specialize in executive coaching and consulting on leadership and culture change.
And coming south of the border, going a little bit further east, is Tamara Gillis.
I don't know about south of the border, but I'm Tamara Gillis. I am a professor of communications at Elizabethtown College here in windy central Pennsylvania. I think the snow's coming our way there, Kelly.
And then last on the panel, we're having some video difficulty. We've got a great picture of Jim Shaffer from Annapolis.
Thanks, Brad. Jim Shaffer. I lead the Jim Shaffer Group, which focuses on organizational change, improving performance through stronger leaders and more turned-on, excited people. My background includes a lot of the different areas we're going to be talking about today. I started out as a gubernatorial governor's press secretary. I have been head of public affairs, public relations, marketing communications, and product line management.
So I'm glad to have a distinguished group here who've been in many of the seats and have probably seen generations of change that go through organizations and seen pendulums move from where do communications functions reside and where do they best fit. And I don't think there is a clean answer that we're going to come up with a definitive one by the end, but I think we should have some healthy discussion around things. I guess the first question I'd pose to the group is, what is the impetus for change? Why is it that everybody's now talking about the convergence, especially around marketing and communications?
Why don't I jump in and hopefully start the ball rolling, but maybe start some controversy too. From the education point of view, one of the things we saw this over 10 years ago. You know, when you think back to the early 2000s, when social media really became a prominent tool for corporations and organizations coming out of the shadows of some dorm rooms and things like that. It was you couldn't ignore social media. So as an example, here in our curriculum since 1999, our curriculum has changed every 18 months to 2 years because we're constantly trying to acknowledge different communication tools that our graduates are going to need to perform tasks for your organizations. And a lot of this centers around this idea of the converged model where all media are part of the mix, where in the old days, if you want to think of it that way, we thought about traditional media and social media as very separate. And then you add on top of that from communication channels, the layer of who is communicating, whether it's our public relations or public-facing communications entities, or our human resources, our corporate executive office, and you have quite a slurry.
I remember, I'll continue. I remember 20 years ago when I worked for Compaq Computers before I started working with you, Brad, at HP before the merger, where I worked with an organization that was called Integrated Marketing Communication. And that was seen as something that was really different because we were fighting for ownership. We were fighting, people were trying to decide who owned the intranet, who owned digital, who owned employee communications. And I think we're getting out of that conversation and start talking about more collaboration and the right kind of communication we need to deliver the solutions our organizations need.
I've been intrigued by the kind of breathless conversation that we've been having and some of the articles that I've been reading. And I kind of, the first time I read, I think it was something by Weber Shandwick, that I stepped away from, and I thought only would communication people lead with structure instead of leading with strategy. I come out of a management consulting firm prior to starting my own business, and you always start with the strategy. This structure shouldn't be driving this stuff. So you start about what are you going to organize to do, and then eventually you take a look at how should we organize to deliver or execute this strategy. If you've got a problem with structure and that's the root cause of why you're not delivering on the strategy, then you want to address it. But to lead with that seems a little counter what we learn in business school.
And it also is a time when we are seeing some traditional lines being blurred. I mean, I think one of the questions was, external versus internal, and we've certainly seen as you get contract people and part-time people and people on the outside who sometimes need more information than people who might be on the inside, this traditional, this person is a card-carrying employee and this person is not, certainly being challenged. And so the how we communicate internally and externally to audiences is up for grabs. It's changing.
It's Kelly here. I think the best thing that ever happened to me was in 2000, I was put in a position of Vice President of Marketing and Product Development, and I went kicking and screaming because I loved being VP of Corporate Communication. And because I went and crossed the line over to the other silo, it just blew my mind how many things we could have been collaborating on better when I was in my old role. So I think the conundrum, I totally agree with Jim that, strategy needs to precede structure, but I think the conundrum is that silos are alive and well quite beyond marketing and communication. And so who you get to lead that function, do they have the corporate communication expertise or the marketing expertise, and do they really get how both need to integrate?
So I guess one of the questions I would pose is what is the driver behind some of this stuff? I mean, is it the influx of social media that's making us re-explore some of these boundaries, or has this been an ongoing debate?
I think it's, one of the things I always talk about is that the power of what we do as communicators is not to communicate on behalf of our organizations, but to influence how our organizations, its people, and its leaders communicate. And I think social media has made that very prolific. We're realizing that it's not one group controlling a message anymore. It really is about influencing, training, really bringing up the communication skills of the organizations we have so that they're out there talking on our behalf.
Well, I think you raise a good question, Brad. What is the point of it? I really haven't seen anything. I guess I'm, again, coming from the standpoint of what's failing in my business or IBM or Procter & Gamble that people think they need to reorganize the communication function because it is the root cause of a problem that we're having out in the performance world. I don't think I'm hearing that kind of discussion. I don't hear CEOs say, you know, I'm having trouble sleeping at night because we're failing in trying to get new products to market faster. And I tell you what, if we just get our communication people more integrated, we get new products to market faster. I don't think there is a business case that I've heard.
I think there's tremendous value. I think that one of the things that I've been intrigued by, and would love to get your concept around all of this stuff, is the how often do people put an organization in place based around a leader or someone in charge? I mean, do things need to report to marketing? Do things need to report to communications? Do they need to report into? I mean, we've seen HR sometimes do employee communications. How much of it is based around a person leading a function, grooming them for a leadership thing, as opposed to something that makes sense on the structural side of things?
Well, I did a organizational study for a large healthcare organization, medical institute in Rochester, Minnesota. So I think everybody probably knows that it's a Mayo Clinic. But one of the things that they asked me to do was to help them identify where internal communication should sit in the organization. And I believe it's situational, and it has to do with care and feeding. It has to do with who we're trying to improve in terms of performance. And one of the things that I discovered there was that the care and feeding was really going to be more in the corporate communication function, and they would be more successful overall in driving the operating performance of the Mayo Clinic. About 3 weeks later, I was working at IBM with the head of human resources for one of the business units. And she was telling me that it was very important for her because her assignment was to increase workforce capability. And she said, I need the internal communication people to be very close to me, because communication, internal communication, is going to drive the ability to improve workforce capability. It turned out that I recommended that because of that reason, so that she'd get her bonus and she'd be successful, she needed that resource next to her. But it was because of a business reason in both cases that we identified where it ought to go. It wasn't just because it'd be kind of fun to have somebody over here, or we have some other need. It was a business reason that we made that decision.
And that's something I'm getting really excited about. The clients that have started approaching me lately, and it's been a market change in how I'm seeing the problem position for me, is they come to me with a business problem to solve. I need to make sure our people actually are more adaptable to change or understand change in our organization and what we're trying to do operationally. We need to connect more to our mobile workforce that's not, attached to a computer. How do we do that so that they understand where we're going? So we actually start with a business problem and then help connect the dots. So it's the right communication at the right time, whatever it is, in order to drive that business solution. And that's really exciting for me. And that's something I've seen change over the last, I'd say, about 6 months.
Kelly, anything on that topic in terms of solving the business problems?
Well, one of the other gigs I did was Senior VP of Business Strategy. And so one of the articles that Jim wrote talked about how strategy has to precede everything and drive everything. And he also talked about the customer experience, which I was responsible for. And I think a lot of organizations screw up, frankly, on that front. And business strategy is something that the executives do at a groovy retreat, and then everybody continues to do things pretty much the way they did before. So I think making sure that strategy is practical and drills down to every part of the organization is important.
Well, it's also fascinating to see that at a time when we have the tools that allow us to segment and target audiences down to, like the nth degree, we're also seeing a move toward a blurring and a blending of these audiences too. Using external tools to reach internal, not necessarily having the boundaries set up, people using YouTube channels for what would historically have been internal things, that external people can see them. So is that a trend that people are seeing and applauding and using to good effect?
I know when I was managing internal communications at Canada's largest grocery retailer, when we did a reorganization, we built our internal messaging with the line of sight that messaging was going to be picked up externally. And every single time we launched something, what was quoted in the media was the president's message from the internal memo, not necessarily what was coming out on the media release.
I think this goes to transparency. And I mean, Priya's example is an excellent example of that. The public is asking us to be more transparent with our corporate communication, and the multitude of media options, channel options that we have now to reach internal and external audiences allows for that transparency. And hopefully, as communicators, we're planning that it's not an accident.
And we have had historically times when there are things where we collaborate very tightly. I think of, for publicly held companies, certainly in the U.S., the coordination of earnings releases. It's like why don't we just tell shareholders and the street and employees the same message all at the same time? Some of that is driven by regulation, but I see it increasingly in other areas as well. That wasn't a question, but jumped right in there.
It's true. I think the one thing that I noticed a lot in terms of even those president's messages being picked up externally was what they were picking up was the empathy. They were when we were talking about a really tough situation, we weren't just providing the facts over there. We were providing a message that conveyed feeling and tone and other things from an internal perspective that I think really resonated with those external audiences as well.
I did like the one article that appeared in Communication World by Katie McCauley that talked a little bit about an episode where two Walmart directors at a social media conference this past year said that there isn't internal or external anymore. Great content is great content. And both the senior director of digital communications, senior director of employee communications worked together hand in hand to make sure the content wasn't internal or external, but eternal.
What does that mean?
Sounds good.
Yeah, it sounds real good. I'm not sure there's a lot of substance behind it.
Well,
I think that large organizations like Walmart really have to think that way because they're pervasive in our society, in every community, and for them not to be forthcoming that way with information, they become a big bullseye out there for everyone to attack for hiding information or sharing it inappropriately. So for larger organizations, they are on the forefront of this, to use their term, eternal type of communication. And as smaller organizations build their communication functions, when you think about entrepreneurs who grow to small and middle-sized companies, they're learning firsthand these experiences, and we see them starting out with converged communications plans and strategies, as opposed to having to retool and re-engineer their hierarchies into something more systematic.
Tamara, let me ask just sort of a follow-on to that from the academic side of things. I remember many years ago being impressed with, I think it was Northwestern that had put together an integrated communications program. Is that a trend that you're seeing across many, many campuses and trying to blend some of these things that corporations are beginning to look for?
I wouldn't say it's a trend anymore. It is now an expectation for our corporate programming. I'm at a very small institution, and our corporate side is very much integrated. While we may still have separate courses for internal type of comms and public relations and journalistic writing and things like that, at the end of the student's experience, they're applying all of that to a client problem. So you see that not as a, as an upcoming trend, but it's the norm. It's the new normal.
And isn't that the same norm that is driving things like the SCMP and CMP exam that IABC is delivering? It's really about understand what does it mean to be a communication professional, and what is the cross section of capabilities we need to have as a profession, which does involve convergence and understanding of the various disciplines. We saw that during our IABC brand task force exercise when we rebranded the association a few years ago, that the message we were hearing loud and clear was, while many of the associations were picking where they wanted to have expertise, we saw an opportunity with the converging of the disciplines so that we really were talking about the right communication at the right time to deliver the solution.
Well, are there areas where we do need to stay separate? Some functions that don't necessarily, I mean, I hate to think of siloed, but that need to have sort of separate and different treatment than the rest.
Yeah, that's something that I agree with. I think that first of all, if we were talking about an article that I had written recently, the external communication people could have as a role building the brand promise. The internal communication people, and I'm not talking about news and information distribution. I'm talking about the stuff that is business advisory services, consulting services, where they're adding value to the organization. That kind of communication management inside is driving information that people need in order to improve their jobs. And that kind of work has got to be producing gains that are greater than the cost of producing them, or the communication people are going to continue what's happening inside. And that is, they're doing a lot of stuff, but they're not improving results, and they're certainly not adding value. So the important piece of this is that we need to have more communication consultant types working in organizations that are able to coach and counsel the leadership, have the kind of business and financial acumen to counsel the leadership of the organization, as well as to make sure that people out in the plants and in the sales force have the information that they need in order to take performance to a higher level. That's a very, very different kind of an activity, and it's a needed activity. People need to have competencies in that area. That's very different from marketing, communications, public relations, public affairs, government affairs, and those types of things.
I completely agree with Jim. And just to build on that, I think that in general, having led both functions, and I hate to say it because my first function, or first profession, if you want to call it, not the oldest profession, but the first one, was corporate communication. But I generally have found the marketers to have better business and financial acumen. And so if corporate communicators, in the sense of all the different disciplines that Jim just talked about, want to have that counselor ability with senior management, they need to be delivering the value and demonstrating that they're solving problems using business and financial acumen. I think another point is that, yes, we need the different capabilities, and no matter where they reside, as long as there are some common goals that are directly related to the business strategy metrics, that sure makes people want to work together better.
Well, and Jim, I think you actually hinted about that with someone whose bonus was tied to delivery. So you do sometimes what you pay for.
That's right. Exactly.
It's also sort of an interesting thing that I'm hearing, because I think we've also hit upon messaging in some ways. What kinds of information need to be shared with which audiences, which I think has always been a job that we have faced in communications and marketing. And when I think of things like traditional HR, there is that general plan description, things about benefits, but when it gets down to my information, I don't necessarily need to see that shared on the external side of things. So there are some places where we have to see some lines of defining internal and external, I guess.
I think the technology is starting to help drive that, because there's a ton of tools that are out there right now that allow people to customize and personalize. so that, and then it requires some training from a communicator's part to understand how to use those systems to target the audiences appropriately as well. You know, we do that sometimes just through our planning process, but it's also understanding what are the technology and tools that help us get there.
I should remind everybody that if you do have a question for anybody on the panel, you can submit questions. We're monitoring hashtag COF27. We're at episode 27 of this Circle of Fellows. So if you do have a question, send it on in and we'll get it up for you guys. But I think I jumped on a comment you were starting to make, Jim.
Yeah, one of the things that I was going to point out is that while we want more communication practitioners inside organizations helping to guide the organization and its improvement and identifying communication breakdowns that are causing people to underperform and then doing something about that. Unfortunately, we talk about the social media and the technology, which, you know, I'm surrounded by as I sit here in Annapolis. However, what I'm seeing is it's pushing a lot of our communication people, particularly younger people, into what I refer to as the tactical abyss. They are so hung up in the day-to-day activity, there is little focus on results. And so we're becoming, some of us are becoming activity-oriented folks. We're doing a lot of stuff with social media, but not necessarily anything that's really causing the return stuff that can be higher, the quality, the on-time delivery, or whatever it may be that we're trying to do to differentiate ourselves in the marketplace. And we're losing a lot of that because of that kind of activity that's there. But somebody's got to do it.
Is there one discipline? I mean, we sort of hit upon, well, maybe the marketing side of the house traditionally has a little bit more closer ties to the business and results, and the finance side. And I'm also sort of hearing, you know, if you want to become a well-rounded communicator who's going to be able to move into the strategic role, you probably need to sit in multiple seats and learn some of these specialties and the disciplines.
I think it's really interesting, especially when you're working inside organizations and inside large, you know, corporations, that it's, again, what's the role you play in that specific situation, right? There will be, often it'll be an operational leader who's taking the role on a new distribution system. It'll be maybe it's a marketing leader who's taking the lead on brand, but in any, or an HR leader who's taking the lead on a restructuring. But it's really about being there as a communicator with a seat at the table to support, and in some cases lead the initiatives when you get a chance to do. So again, I think it's getting the right people at the table, creating a culture where there's collaboration, but having somebody who drives that through a really great communications program and process.
Which hinges on having excellent relationships, whether you have a seat at the table or not.
Exactly.
If you have really good relationships across marketing and communication, or any other part of the organization for that matter, you will be sought out if you add value.
And if you have a point of view, because it's not about just sitting at the table and not contributing.
Exactly.
Yeah, Priya, Terry Simpson, who used to head internal communication at FedEx, said just that. She said, you know, it's not about having a seat at the table. It's what you do when you're there.
Exactly.
A lot of the reason why people are not invited to the table is because they know that they're not going to offer much when they get in the room.
Right.
Now, do we, if we start to see more convergence, do we start to see a watering down of some of the specialties, or, you know, less of an emphasis on things, or is that, if there's a downside to convergence, what might it be?
I'd like to chime in on that one. I think it's time management, because with the multiple channels and coordinating messaging through a number of different units as well as channels, it's a matter of time. How much time do we have to produce the message, and are we choosing channels because of how quickly we can distribute and produce it, or are we choosing them because they're the highest quality and where we're going to get our best return on the investment, both our intangible and tangible resources. So I see organizations making choices that look like knee-jerk responses because they needed to get it done fast, and perhaps in hindsight that wasn't really the best of use of their time, but again, time was not on their side.
Sometimes you have to go slow to go fast.
Yeah.
I think as well, on both the inside and the outside as a consultant, I still look for the experts. Right? There's still the experts at advertising and marketing. The role that I'm playing right now temporarily for a large nurses union in Ontario is actually running their entire communication and government relations team. And with that, I've got a team of 8 who all have different pieces of expertise that they bring to the table. But I also have agencies that I go out to as needed from an advertising perspective, from a lobbying perspective, all of those pieces where it's really about building the right team at the right time for the purpose, the right purpose. So it really, I don't think that we're diluting the expertise. I find that the expertise changes the higher you get up in the organization based on the size of the organization and what your mandate is.
It's a little hard to address a subject like organizational structure, which is what we're really kind of, what's the good and the bad of convergence. I'd really rather step back. I guess it's just kind of in my DNA to step back and say, okay, let's look at the strategy first, and what are the capabilities we need, capabilities being the things we have to be particularly good at to win in the marketplace. What do we need to play? What do we need to win? And then what competencies do we need? And oh, by the way, somewhere in this conversation, we'll get to structure. So, and how we organize. And so I think I would prefer that this discipline, the communication discipline, step back a little bit and get de-enamored over how they're going to be orienting themselves from a structure standpoint, and start doing something that we don't do enough in the communication profession, and that is worry about strategy execution.
It sounds as if you've made organizational structure for communications almost another one of those bright, shiny objects that we love to chase after, whether it's desktop publishing or social media or video for the corporation. It's not necessarily the most important, and that comes with a little bit of discipline and a little bit of hindsight and a little bit of wisdom of ages.
Well, it has happened before, hasn't it, Brad? You just rattled them off there, with videos and the intranets and all that stuff. There is an unwillingness to really wrestle with the business issues that are making money or saving money. I've got a client who, she's a vice president of communication now at the University of Nebraska, used to be at Conagra Foods, and she had a value proposition at Conagra Foods that her team put together, and I was working with her at the time, and she said our value proposition is we either do things that make money or save money. If it doesn't make or save money, we don't do it. She's a brilliant woman because she took that approach. She didn't say, well, now let's have a off-site meeting about how we ought to organize. She started out with what we're going to contribute to this big consumer packaged goods company.
Even with the branding program, we also had our values that we introduced from an IABC perspective. And my 2 favorite, I would say, is we're focused on insights and results, and we create connection. Right? It's the role that we have the potential to play to get the right people connected in the right organizations and expertise connected in order to solve the business problem.
Yeah, it's not about connections. It's actually about results. Connections are the means to getting those results.
Exactly.
Well, in some ways, the connections take care of themselves. I mean, in organizations, you cannot help but have connections, and there's sort of a non-formal network of things that happen between people that actually get things done that almost supplants the org chart. And in some ways, I guess I look at org charts as anachronistic. It's like you have to have some sort of structure, and you have to have reporting relationships for some administrative things, but oftentimes it's this very dynamic way of getting things done that we've been alluding to, and I think social media amplify that. I don't know if anybody else has seen that, but you don't necessarily have to have, as you said, it's more about the relationship than it is about the structure to get work done in an organization.
In one of my organizations, we used to call them the STPs, the same 10 people who were part of every initiative because they were the ones who were the influencers and connectors.
Yeah, I would say in an awful lot of the change efforts that I've done that we're relying on people with personal power, not just with position power. And it can sometimes be the person in the mailroom who gets around to the entire organization, and people go say to her or him, "What's up? What's really going on?" And so I think a lot of what we're doing now is getting unofficial leaders involved in change processes.
What you're describing is something that Karen Stephenson wrote about a few years ago in a book she wrote called The Quantum Theory of Trust, where she looked at organizations and said, we should look for these informal connections that people have, whether it's through, as Jim just described, the function that they perform. They connect with a lot of people walking through the building every day delivering mail, or the mentorship relationships that they have, or not just by job category on the hierarchy chart, but on the relationships that people have built within the organization. Some of them we can see and some of them we can't see.
Now, I remember hearing Karen give a presentation once at Berkeley, and she put up an org chart that had, this is the R&D department, this is manufacturing, this is sales. Then there's a sliver of people down beneath who are extraordinarily well connected. She said, do you know who these people are that connect these organizations? Because there were a few dots connecting these things in the spider web diagram. And down at the very bottom, everybody's like, I have no idea. She said, those are the smokers. There aren't a lot of them, but they all go out and they all stand around the ashtray,
yeah,
the size of the Sahara Desert, because now in some ways they're pariah. They can't do anything, but they have a great way of sharing across an organization. I think part of the, what we're hitting upon is that convergence happens many, many ways. And some of it can be that structural thing that's imposed that you need to do for the org charts and for vice presidents to be able to feel good about things. But it's also the non-formal ways that people connect to actually get the work done.
That's right.
Absolutely.
It reminds me of a book by Art Kleiner called Who Really Matters. And he tells this story about a young rising star who's at an evening drinking fest at an offsite with some senior executives, and the alcohol loosens his tongue. He wasn't a corporate communicator, just so I don't tarnish their brand. And he says the customer comes eighth, because they had been talking about the customer experience all day. And then he proceeds to point to each executive in the room and some who aren't in the room about who really matters and who gets stuff done, marshals resources, influences, etc. And so, of course, no matter what discipline you're talking about, no matter what structure you have, that's what really matters. There are informal and formal power networks that drive what business gets done.
So what about integration? I mean, is this a movement that we need to worry about? Has this been sort of an underlying theme forever? I mean, I can remember in years past, there was a huge discussion about whether the employee communication function should belong to HR or to corporate communications. I remember discussions about whether, some of the social, I mean, is this something we just need to, put in its proper place? And then how do we as communications people go about and say, it's really not necessarily as important as the strategy? I mean, how do you fight that battle?
I think, Jim has mentioned several times it's not about structure. And actually, I don't think this topic is just about structure. I think it's a philosophical orientation that all of us who are involved in corporate communication, marketing, and the various related disciplines should be espousing.
Yeah, I think the customer is going to sort it out for us. And maybe, I think that may be my Lean Six Sigma background, but we can have all these shiny bright objects, as Brad mentioned, and we can have this little, this is the big thing this year and that sort of thing. But it all works out, in the end, the customer starts to drive things, and we start listening to them, and we try to be responsive, and we want to improve our on-time delivery. We want to improve the quality, we want to improve the service delivery, and that sort of thing. And pretty soon the fads start to go away, because you can't afford to maintain the cost of a fad when you've got other things that are really going to work and cause the performance to go up.
But to tack on to that, Jim, I think it also is it's an issue of education, and I'm not talking about college education. I'm talking about educating members of your organization, because if a CEO and the C-suite values communication and sees it as one of the components that is critical to these other value propositions, they're going to integrate it. They're going to find ways to circumvent the chart, the org chart, and use everyone's talents to meet that demand. But if you're dealing with, I'll call them traditionalists, people who, just see information flowing in one direction in the organization, and you have your place and don't get out of it, it's not going to happen. And we see that in the news. We see that with organizations who flounder. And when you start to look into their experiences, communication, the information wasn't getting heard across the company. Well, is it really our fault, or is it the organization not valuing that? So I think there is an opportunity for communicators to add value, but also to improve their lot by being their own ambassadors.
And I think that I think the big change, though, is that communicators have to let go a little bit of having to control the message and deliver the stuff that they associate their value with. And that's the biggest barrier sometimes, because I see it here. I've seen organizations I've talked to where the communicator is held really tight to, this is how we do things. I'm more concerned about how we design the newsletter than I am about delivering on the strategy. And more often than not, they're talking themselves out of a job, because what executives are saying to me are, we don't understand why our communicators don't understand, or why they're not collaborating. So it's a little bit about letting go, being able to come in and offer your expertise at the table. And it's more about collaboration versus being a jack of all trades per se.
But do you guys see a time when perhaps communications people are not needed in organizations, because we've done such a good job of training executives and supervisors and everybody else to do the communication?
I think there's one organization that's coming close to that, and that's Springfield Remanufacturing. It was Jack Stack who wrote the book, The Great Game of Business, and it's all about open book management. Open book management, I'm sure you all know, but maybe some of the audience doesn't know, is that where all employees, before they even go to the floor, whether it's the sales floor, the truck floor, the manufacturing floor, they have to understand how to manage the cash flow statement, the income statement, and the balance sheet. They have all the information that anybody would need to be able to run their piece of the organization. In many, many cases, that open book management is a culture of an organization in such a way that they don't have a communication person, because they don't need it, because they all are communication people. I just spoke to the world's largest conference of open book companies in Dallas in September, and most of those people don't have communication practitioners because they don't need them. They value communication inside the organization so much that they have the information that they need.
Yeah, that's a different sort of way of going about doing things, because historically we've talked about the need to know, and restrictions, whether it's the financial people don't want to have data being shared, or the legal people don't want something shared, or HR people say you can't share that because of personnel information. How do you move to something where it's a little less the role of a communications person to decide who, where, and how we communicate what information?
That's a good question. I think you know what, it's been interesting that I think it's really about about taking all what we're seeing in a lot of organizations is usually when they're disappointed with communication, it's either there's not enough, nobody's telling us anything and we don't trust the organization, or there's too much. There's just a bunch of noise and we're creating all kinds of stuff and we're not helping people understand and prioritize and focus. And that's the role that we've got, the potential to play is really, I love the Jim's example, but it requires some training and it requires some discipline in the organization and an infrastructure that is put in place that allows that free flow of information, but also allows the decision making on what do you share and what don't you, and when are you crossing that fine line between not enough information and too much, right? I think there is still a role to play to help drive, and most organizations aren't, if you have no one there, they're either falling on one side or the other.
Yeah, I would agree.
Be able to make decisions as if they were the leader of an organization, and sometimes the only way you can do that is figuring out how to share those insights from a leader. Yeah. But Jim?
Yeah, I agree, and I don't think many people are going to get to the point where they are open book companies, except smaller organizations. It's very difficult in larger organizations to do that. I have an exercise that I work with leadership teams on. It's called How Open is Open, and it's usually the CEO and the leadership team, and I won't go through the whole process, but essentially we start with a scale of 1 to 10. 1 is absolutely closed about everything here, and 10 is absolutely open. And then I ask the leadership team, well, where do you want to be? And they say, well, we want to be a 10, of course. And then I give them an example. The chief financial officer has just been caught with his hand in the till. We're going to terminate him this afternoon and announce exactly why we're terminating him, because we want to use it as a way to communicate the value that we don't steal from the company. Well, you can imagine what the leadership team says at that point. Oh, well, I don't think we do that. We got to protect his dignity and his respect and blah, blah, blah. And that leads to a conversation. And then we end up maybe at a 7 or a 6 or wherever we end up with on that 1 to 10. So putting that in place and having them have that conversation and understand the upside and the downside of various degrees of openness helps them then create a structure that enables that kind of an environment to occur.
It comes back to some of the discussion around structure and what makes the most sense. And what I'm also hearing is that the transparency involved with that putting together the structure too is going to sort of dictate the final shape of it, and it could be very, very different. I think the other thing that I was going to ask and sort of see, because we've hit on some examples from small organizations to large organizations, different industries that people behave in. Are there some places that make more sense to see the convergence and some places where it's okay to be a little bit separate? Or is this notion of total participation, total communications, a universal thing?
I think in a perfect world, we'd probably like it to be a universal thing, but depending on the size of the organization and the nature of their business, as Jim has touched upon with some risk organizations and things like that, it can't be. We'll never live in that utopia.
Well, one client I had was a Central Intelligence Agency for a while, and I can assure you that there were restrictions on degrees of openness.
Well, I also had worked with a university at one point, and there was a discussion of wouldn't it be great to have an internal communications function so that the people over in the history department knew exactly what was going on over here in geology? And the answer was probably not. The people in history were probably more interested in talking to other people in other campuses, other universities who were practicing history than they were in talking to their friends over on the other side of the campus. So I think that gets back to the understanding the function of an organization well enough to figure out what structure do you want to put in place and what information needs to be shared, and can silos exist in organizations, and does everything need to be totally transparent? I think it also gets back to a concept which is, I think, sort of built into some of this stuff, is with social media and some of the new communication vehicles that are available to us, the notion of subscribing to information that helps you do your job better. And I think the whole notion of historically, we in communications have decided what it is that people need to do their job better. We're getting to the point now where tools will allow people to subscribe to stuff and unsubscribe to stuff. And just because two people are sitting next to one another doing essentially the same job doesn't mean they necessarily have the same information needs. And you've seen that manifest itself in different ways with people getting to decide what they need as opposed to one of us deciding what it is that people need.
I think that what Jim's talking about with his How Open is Open exercise, which is intriguing, it is about deliberately designing culture. So to me, what the marketers and the communicators need to do is get together and figure out, okay, philosophically, where do we really need to be converged? Quite aside from structure, and agree on that. And where is it completely okay for us to inform and, you know, use a racy matrix or whatever to conduct things within our areas of capability? Where it gets a little tricky, and I've done some team dynamic work, conflict work with marketing and communication teams recently, is who has decision rights on the areas where you've decided convergence is necessary. So what's the culture of the organization around conflict and how to resolve it? Does it go up the silos and you get the top dogs to argue it out? Or do you have tools in place to have people who are peers across silos work things out?
Yeah, I think that kind of analytical approach makes a lot of sense. We have an assessment that we do. It's called a value to cost assessment. It has 3 dimensions. Number one, how well do these activities, communication activities, this is a survey of employees, how well do these activities help you do your job better? To what extent on a scale of 1 to 5? How effective is it on a scale of 1 to 5? And then 3, the third dimension is a fully loaded cost with benefit costs, compensation costs, as well as operating costs. We take a look at that and we step back and we can look at that 4-box matrix. Here are the ones that are high importance, high performance, high importance, low performance. They need to be improved upon. And then in the bottom 2 boxes are low importance. We can redeploy those dollars or those investments, resources in those lower 2 boxes to bring more of our activities up to that high importance, high performance. So that is one way to start to spend money in a way that adds more value and gets rid of some of the crap out there that is not adding any value to the enterprise.
I think it's also eventually, I mean, it's something I remember from HP, Brad, is that we learn to manage by objective. Like even when you're managing people virtually, it was really about us measuring ourselves on impact, not necessarily on content and what we're delivering out there. And kind of what you're talking about, Jim, about putting things, really having an internal lens and looking at what we're doing and asking ourselves, what should we be focused on, and not focusing on, you know, a number of hours or the stuff, but really thinking about those outcomes that we're trying to drive.
Yeah, and doing it where you're asking them the extent to which that activity helps you do your job better. Isn't that what we're looking for people to do? Improve how they do their jobs. So absolutely.
Well, we've reached the top of the hour. I know that Tamara actually has a class that she needs to go and teach, so we're going to have to say goodbye to her very quickly. So Tamara Gillis, thank you. Also want to thank Priya Bates, Kellie Garrett, and Jim Shaffer for having a great discussion around this topic of convergence, the blurring lines within organizations and where the communication functions reside. I want to remind you that coming up next month, we have another Circle of Fellows. Shel Holtz will be back in his moderator chair. Well, actually not this chair, his chair, not mine. And he's joined by Lee Hornick, George McGrath, Barbara Puffer, and Cindy Schmieg, who will all be talking about the topic of building a long-term reputation strategy for an organization. So I want to thank my 4 fellows for spending time with us today, and look forward to hearing the next Circle of Fellows. So thank you very much, and we look forward to talking to you soon.
Bye, Brad. Thank you.
Bye.